Museums all over the world are presented with the challenge of preserving and presenting stories and events of the past, and to help make these relevant and compelling to the younger generation. The Holocaust Museum in Melbourne, Australia is unique because visitors come into contact with living history. Each of the volunteer guides who interact with the visitors are themselves survivors of the Holocaust. They're able to help students and educators relate to the events of the Shoah through first-hand accounts of their own experiences. The museum and the guides are faced with the difficult question of how their stories and memories will be passed on to future generations when the survivors are no longer able to do so. Using the unique StoryPod framework, the museum was able to create a facsimile of the experience of interacting with a survivor. Each StoryPod contains several stories of survival and accounts of events that unfolded over the course of the Second World War. These stories are told using multimedia installations where visitors touch and interact with virtual representations of historical artifacts. Each of the StoryPods is created after painstaking research by the curatorial staff at the museum. The curators pore through the archives and piece together each story using primary source documents and artifacts. This material is then digitized and presented using the unique StoryPod framework. Each StoryPod has a unique interface that allows the visitor to interact with the stories of survivors. For instance, in the interface before us, there are a number of images scattered on the desk. What we can do is touch each image to learn more about the individual. For instance, if we touch upon the image of the gentleman here, we learn that his name is George Ginsberg, and it tells us a little bit about when he was born and a little bit about his story. Let us learn more about George. Touching that image of his reveals this amazing desk, and on this desk are placed several objects from George's personal belongings. Each object can now be touched to find out a little bit more about George. So for instance, the piece of paper in front of us, if we touch that, it tells us some facts about George and his story. The camera in the corner, when we touch the camera, it reveals a slideshow of images from George's personal collection. Similarly, all of the images can be interacted with. One object that often draws the attention of younger visitors is the medal. Touching the medal reveals the medal to us. Now normally, an object such as this would have to be held behind glass, and visitors would not normally be able to interact with it. However, with the StoryPod technology, we're able to turn the medal around to see the inscription behind it. Similarly, we explore other objects. The paper clippings in the corner reveal various media stories that have appeared about George and his story. The little box reveals a pile of images that we can then move around just as if it were a real pile of photographs. And we can look at them sequentially as well. Let us look at another StoryPod. This is yet another StoryPod with a different set of survivors. Once again, we can touch each of the images to learn a little bit about each individual. And we can further click this image to learn more about David Prince. David was a chemist, and hence we have objects from his chemistry practice on his StoryPod. Here we see a photograph of David and his teacher when he was young, who inspired him to go on and become a chemist. Other interesting objects within the storypods themselves are things like the little fob watch. The fob watch reveals an animated timeline that incorporates archive footage, images from the personal collection of the survivor, as well as painstaking work done by the historians and curators at the museum.
The photo which was sent from Poland in the late 20s to one of my mother's.
We can also navigate using this list of key events on the right hand side. We're able to navigate through the landscape of the events that took place over the course of the Second World War, but told from the perspective of the individual. Another object that is often of much interest to visitors are the books. In this instance, we have a book titled Friends Forever. Touching the little magnifying glass zooms the image so we can see it a bit better. And now we can interact with the book just as if it was made out of real paper and it was a real book. Turning the pages, we learn of exchanges of stories between Adolek, a friend of David's, when they were interned. We can turn each of the pages and observe how the pages themselves behave exactly like real paper. This allows visitors to interact with primary source documents that would normally have been held within the confines of the archives and only available to scholars and select few people, but we're now able to unlock these treasures to everyday visitors. We have seen two of the storypods that tell the stories of survivors. Let us now look at a couple of the installations that deal with the events of the Holocaust. This particular installation is titled Acts of Courage, and this focuses on honoring those individuals who bravely defied the Nazi regime. So we're able to interact with various objects, such as this medal awarded to righteous individuals through the Yad Vashem Righteous Among the Nations program, or objects that were bequeathed to the museum. We can also interact with the map itself, looking at different continents. It shows us the different nations in that continent, in this instance Europe, and we can learn more about acts of courage and righteousness through all these nations. Let us look at Great Britain. This tells us that there were two courageous individuals in Great Britain. Let us look at the story of Francis Edward Foley. We now learn about Francis's story. The screen also tells us about other individuals, such as Jane, and we can learn more about her story. Similarly, we can explore, in sequential order, acts of courage from around the world. Yet another aspect of this installation is this sheaf of papers in the corner. Clicking on this, touching this particular list, reveals a book, and in fact, this is Schindler's List. The now famous list compiled by Oskar Schindler to save Jews who worked in his factory in Plaszow, Poland. This is the actual list that Oskar Schindler compiled, and now visitors are able to interact with it firsthand. The last installation we will look at is the one titled Fate of the Jewish Communities. This installation talks about the lives that were lost in various parts of Europe across the different nations. Here we see several symbolic candles signifying each of those nations and the lives that were lost there. For instance, we can touch the candle for France, and it tells us the story of the events that took place in the nation of France and the percentage of Jewish lives lost there. Similarly, we can traverse through Germany in alphabetical order, learning about the lives that were lost in each of these nations and the stories of the events that took place there. The Holocaust Museum in Melbourne has successfully installed a large number of touch-based exhibits that are being used by educators and survivors to pass on the lessons learned from the Holocaust.